All right, it is now 11:02. We have 39 participants online. So Thomas, why don't we go ahead and get started?
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another World Bank Library book discussion. Today's session is particularly striking because it involves one of the great minds of our time, Herman Daly, and Dr. Peter Victor. As you will note from Peter's accent, he's from North London, but he's going to be with us from Ontario, Toronto, actually, where he now lives. I want to give particular thanks to Julia Oblete and the staff at the library for helping to organize this. And I am actually honored and delighted to say a word about Peter Victor. Peter almost was hired by the World Bank because he was invited to a lunch several years ago by Herman Daly when Herman was still alive, and Bob Goodland, who is another environmental economist, and they tried to hire him to work at the World Bank. But he decided no, and he went on to great glory. He's a very prolific author. He has many, many awards. And the title of the book that he's going to discuss today, is Herman Daly's Economics for a Full World, His Life and Ideas. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Peter Victor from Toronto, Canada. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for the introduction, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you about Herman Daly. What I'm going to attempt to do is to cover the main points that are in the book. The book's nearly 300 pages, so you'll have to excuse me for being quite brief in many aspects. So what I'm going to go through is some of his early influences. Who influenced Herman? How did he get these ideas that have come to be so significant? I would then want to talk about his view, early developed view, that economics might be better thought of as a life science, more akin to biology and ecology than to physics. Then we'll talk about what I think is his major contribution to economics, which is his analysis and promotion of a steady state economy. The fourth item is the title of one of his most important books, For the Common Good, which was written more recently in 1989 and then 1994. I also want to cover very, very quickly some of the debates he had in the peer-reviewed literature. And then an item I expect many of you will be particularly interested in is a little bit about his experiences at the World Bank. And I'll finish with an account of the influence that he has had and is still having. So, Herman, here he is as a little boy, 4 and at 6. He was born in Houston, Texas. And if you look at the map, you'll see close to Houston is a town called Beaumont, where the family moved to when he was very young and where he really grew up. So he's a Southerner. And by the way, he loved being from the South, and he loved the South. I tried to tempt him up north. He came for a visit once, but that was it. Early influences. I'll start with his mother, Muriel, who took Herman to church, to a Protestant church, on a very regular basis. And Herman remained a devout Christian throughout his life. And it played a role in his economics because he gave more significance to ethics explicitly as an economist than I think you might find among most economists. When he was 8, he was struck down by polio. This was a terrible disease which was largely eradicated through vaccination. But here in this image, you see polio victims. Many of them were children. This is one of the tragedies of polio. It hit the young. And they're in what was called iron lungs that kept them alive by helping them breathe. Although Herman spent many weeks in hospital, he didn't have to go into an iron lung, but he remembers hearing the sounds they made down the corridor. As a teenager, he worked in his father's hardware store, his father Ted, and that was where Herman learnt a lot of practical things. First of all, his father admitted anybody and everybody into the store, and so there was no distinction made according to color, for example. But Herman also learnt the practical side of life, that you needed nuts and bolts to actually make things. When Herman was 15 and working, well, during the time he was working in the store and at high school, he persuaded his father to let him have his left arm amputated because he couldn't bear this withered arm, just was just an encumbrance, which was, again, one of the lessons he learned was that not everything is possible in this world, that there are limits and that we need to respect them and do the best within them. And then I have to mention that he was growing up in Texas when it was segregated, and he never accepted that. It ran contrary to the church teachings that he was learning all the time. And then here he is as an 18-year-old. He went down to Mexico. The trip had a huge influence on him. He saw another country for the first time, a poorer country, and he regretted for the rest of his life catching this beautiful sailfish. So Herman discovers economics. He went to Rice University even before it was called Rice University. I think it was a polytechnic, where he first encountered economics. He thought that it had its feet grounded in the humanities and the sciences. And since he loved both, he thought economics was the subject he wanted to pursue. However, he was soon to discover that it didn't have its feet in either of those subjects. As he described it, its feet were in the air. And one way of understanding his career is that he tried to reground economics in both the humanities and the sciences. He went on to do his PhD at Vanderbilt University. His supervisor for much of that time was Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, who had a huge influence on his thinking. His first academic position was in the Department of Economics at Louisiana State University. There he is in 1964, where he eventually got his PhD. It took a while, but during that time he did publish 5 papers, so he was very well qualified by the time he became an assistant professor. Now, I mentioned in the introduction, economics as a life science. This is the title of a paper he published in 1968, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. And this diagram comes directly from the paper. It's his representation of biological systems which take in matter and energy, use that in all respects to support life, but the output is degraded matter and degraded energy. Herman realized that you could describe an economy in pretty much the same way. So this is the second part of his diagram, and it shows again matter and energy entering the economy through production and then consumption, and ultimately resulting in matter and energy. So this was a perspective of his that stayed with him his entire life and is really the core perspective of ecological economics to this day. In 1973, he produced this book called Toward a Steady State Economy. It's actually a collection of papers. He wrote a wonderful introduction, quite lengthy, and another paper in this collection. And there were papers by all sorts of eminent writers of the day whose names you would recognize with menu, I hope. We'll take a look at the book for yourselves. This is a diagram that appears in the book. And you'll see it's really an elaboration of what I showed you a moment ago. You have the total environment or ecosystem, the outside box, with the sun coming in. Essentially all that comes into the earth from outer space is solar energy. And then within that you have the economy represented in a rather unusual way, with matter and energy entering, the new becoming old, resulting in waste matter and waste energy going out back into the environment. There is some recycling of matter, no recycling of energy, but there is some recycling of matter. Now this image he's drawn and redrawn many times over the years, but that's the fundamental perspective that he developed all those years ago. He reminds us that the flow of materials is covered by the conservation law, which says the quantity of materials and energy in any process is conserved, so it's materials and energy. But with respect to energy in particular, the capacity of energy to do work declines with use. So the first conservation law is about quantity, the entropy law is about quality, and the fact that the capacity of energy to do work after it's been used once always declines is of fundamental importance to understanding an economy today, just as it was then. What is a steady state economy? Well, in 1973, Herman defined it as an economy with constant population and constant stock of capital, which have to be maintained, as he said, by a low rate of throughput, that's throughput of energy and materials, that is within the regenerative and assimilative capacities of the ecosystem. So in his first understanding of a steady state economy, it was population and the stock of capital that were to be held constant. Many years later, this is in 2008, he twisted it around. He said that a steady state economy can be defined as a constant flow of throughput at a sustainable low level, with population and capital stock free to adjust to whatever size can be maintained by the constant throughput that begins with depletion and ends with pollution. So in the first one, it's the throughput that's held constant, it's the stocks that are held constant with throughput varying. And in the second definition, it's the throughput that's held constant with the stocks of capital and population allowed to vary. The next critical, I think, contribution he made later on in 1992, though he'd been thinking about it a bit before then, was that we need policies not just for allocation efficiency, which is emphasized so much in mainstream economics, of the functioning of the market, but he said we need policies for the scale of the economy, scale being measured in physical terms, so that the physical size of the economy should be decided upon in relation to the capacity of the ecosystem that contains it to sustain it. He said we also need policies for distribution, which is the apportionment of income and wealth among different people, and then, because he saw a logical connection here, a logical hierarchy, and then economics and economic policy can devote its attention to allocation and whether markets or other institutions are appropriate depending upon what the goods and services are that need to be allocated. Finally, from this seminal book in 1993, we have his ends mean spectrum. In this diagram shows political economy, which is the old name for economics, focusing mostly on what he called intermediate means and how they can be used to produce intermediate ends. But he said that the intermediate means come from the ultimate means, which is the low entropy matter energy that governs all economic activity that can unfortunately get ignored too much. That's really the domain of the physical sciences. And at the upper end, he said these intermediate ends are very important, but we need to look beyond that and think about the ultimate end. What is the purpose of life? What is the purpose of our own lives? What is the purpose of our lives collectively? And this is where ethics comes in. And so this was his map of knowledge, which proves, I think, very useful, particularly to students trying to understand where economics fits within the larger framework of human knowledge and understanding. Then in 1989, followed by a second edition in 1994, we see For the Common Good, a book that he co-authored with theologian John Cobb Jr. You'll notice the subtitle there, Redirecting the Economy Toward Community, the Environment, and a Sustainable Future. A very broad book in its scope, highly recommended. I'm just going to pick out one item of particular interest, I think, to the World Bank, and I think you've done some work in this area yourselves, but this was the forerunner. This was his Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare. He's been a long-term critic of GDP as a measure of well-being or welfare, and the attempt here was to come up with something also measured in monetary units, but much more closely related to welfare, and therefore more useful for judging how well an economy is doing. And in its simplest terms, it starts from the normal measures of personal consumption in dollar terms, adds public non-defensive expenditures. They don't include things like expenditures on the police, which are there, which can increase when crime goes up. So they have this whole category, because he worked with colleagues on these defensive expenditures, and he subtracts from GDP the private defensive expenditures, extra locks that you might put on your door because you're unsafe. Add in capital formation, add in the services from domestic labor, which is not included in GDP, subtract the costs of environmental degradation and the depreciation of natural capital. Now, when you do that, as they did in the book nearly 30 years ago, this shows from 1951 to 1990 that GMP, similar to GDP, increased by nearly 2% a year over that time period, whereas the index of sustainable economic welfare rose less than 0.5% on average over that period. Now, when you break it down by decades, as he did, you see that that pattern was sustained throughout that period, the GDP rising much faster than the index of sustainable economic welfare. But in 80 to 90, this was when they diverged very much, because the index showed a decline in well-being in the United States. And Herman, who had a very good way of coming up with neat terms, described this as uneconomic growth, where the economic growth is such that the costs of the growth are outweighing the benefits. And in the US, where this data was applied, the situation was getting worse. Just briefly, Herman loved to debate. He always wanted people to challenge and question his ideas. If there were problems or he was incorrect, please, he would say, correct him. So here is a list of the debates that you can find in the literature. With his mentor and professor on the steady state economy, whether it could last forever or not. I think that was a false debate. Daly never said it would last forever, and Georgescu-Roegen misunderstood him. Daly debated the relevance of thermodynamics to economics, the conservation laws, the entropy law, and so on. I think he won that one. There was a sort of a debate with Bhagwati on free trade in the Scientific American, but they were like ships passing in the night. Daly talked about how free trade was based on the idea of comparative advantage, and comparative advantage was based upon there being free fixed capital immobility. It didn't flow between trading nations. But Bhagwati took up other points. It was a very fruitless debate, I think. There was this debate about whether you do need, in fact, a policy objective for every instrument. I think Daly was on good grounds there, based his ideas on Tinbergen's view of that, who'd won the Nobel Prize for it. He debated with his friend and colleague Sagoff, who was a philosopher, on ethics, knowledge, and whether knowledge could replace resources and capital. They were good friends, but they never came to an agreement on those issues. He also debated with famous economists Solow and Stiglitz separately on economic growth. They were invited to write commentaries on his views. They wrote about 1.5 pages each. It was a perfunctory treatment, and they never really took on seriously the view of production that he'd acquired from Georgescu-Roegen. Again, basing the theory of production in ways that are consistent with the laws of physics. And finally, he had a much more fruitful debate with Kenneth Arrow. The pluses there indicate that they were parts of groups who were debating these things, but they were the leaders of the groups. And there, the answer to the question of are we consuming too much was very interesting because of the differences. Arrow focused more on whether there was too much consumption and too little investment in the economy, and Daly focused much more on the size of the economy was too large in relation to the containing biosphere. Well, in 1988, Herman Daly joined the World Bank. When he did, the science writer Constant Holdren had the following to say. The most unorthodox addition to the World Bank's environmental manpower is economist Herman Daly. Although hell will probably have to freeze over, or the bank adopted the heretical biologically based theory of economics promoted by Daly, many of the practical implications of his ideas are in tune with some of the new directions. Well, I thought that's a very good comment, I think Daly, as far as I have learned from the research that I did, had quite an impact on the World Bank while he was there. But he only lasted 6 years. Oops. No, I've got an episode to tell you about. He was asked in 1992, this is a photograph of Herman, much later than that, of course, to comment on the report that the World Bank was writing on development and the environment. And I'm going to let you hear for yourself what he had to say.
Okay, so here comes the first draft of the report, lands on my desk, so I eagerly read it. And early on in the report, there's a diagram, the caption of which is the relation of the economy to the environment. And there was a picture, and it was a rectangle labeled economy, and an arrow coming in from the left labeled inputs, and an arrow exiting to the right labeled outputs. That was it. No discussion, what is this? Well, I said, okay, here's an opening. They're trying to draw a diagram of the relation of the economy to the environment. And at the bank, you have to be, as all bureaucracy, you try to be polite. So I didn't say this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. This is a good beginning. We've got the economy here, and we've got inputs and outputs, but where's the environment? We don't know where the inputs are coming from. We don't know where they came from. We don't know where the outputs are going. We don't know anything about the relationship between the inputs and the outputs. Why don't we draw a larger circle around this rectangle and label that environment or ecosystem or ecosphere or something like that? Then we would be showing that the economy is a subsystem of the larger biophysical ecosystem. Then it would be clear that the inputs were being extracted from the environment. It would be clear that the outputs, waste, are being expelled back to the environment. We could then talk about the relationship between the inputs and the outputs. They're connected. The concept of a throughput, of an entropic metabolic flow of resources from depletion through production to consumption and to waste. And then we could talk about recycling. We could talk about recycling through the ecosystem by biodegradability. We could talk about internal recycling within the economy of materials. We could then talk about the impossibility of recycling energy. So how do we economize energy to affect the recycling? We could talk about all of these things. We could ask the question of which end of the input is more restrictive, the input in depletion or pollution, and does that change over time? How so? And indeed, we could ask the question, how big is the subsystem economy relative to the total system? That's kind of an interesting question. How big is it? How much of the total does it take up? What are the different ways of measuring that? How big can it be? Is there some maximum beyond which it all collapses? How big should it be? Is there some optimum which is good from the point of view of human beings or all living things or so forth? And we could ask all of these questions, and that would really be a nice thing to do for the World Bank.
So here is the diagram that he was commenting on in the first edition, or the first draft, I should say, of the World Development Report in 1992. When he and he submitted the kind of comments that he's just spoken to us about on this diagram. This is the version that appeared in the second draft. No discussion, by the way, no discussion in the text. But this diagram, he thought that was more of a picture frame than a representation of the containing ecosystem. When the third draft came, nothing. No diagram, no discussion. It was gone. It was too much to take in, apparently, at the time. Well, when Herman left the World Bank, he gave a speech in which he gave advice to the bank, both in terms of its internal operations and its external operations. These are the four key points that he made. That the bank should stop counting the consumption of natural capital as income, that labor should be taxed, labor and income should be taxed less, and resources and throughput should be taxed more. Maximize the productivity of natural capital in the short run and invest in increasing its supply in the long run. And the fourth one, which he considered to be the least likely of his recommendations to be accepted, but all of a sudden has a certain currency these days, move away from the ideology of global economic integration by free trade, free capital mobility, and export-led growth, and toward a more nationalist orientation that seeks to develop domestic production for internal markets as the first option, having recourse to international trade only when clearly much more efficient. Well, I've said quite a lot, as he did, about the metabolism of economies. Just to give you an indication of the influence he has had, here is the sort of diagram that was produced by European academics showing the material throughput of the global economy in 1900. And this is a Sankey diagram, which means that the width of the lines in the diagram represent the magnitude that's being represented by the line. So you can see that materials have been classified into three: fossil materials, biomass, metals, and minerals. And that in 1900, an estimated 7.3, I believe, million tons were extracted and from the containing biosphere, and the diagram shows the flow through of these materials, and you see on the right hand side emissions and solid and liquid waste outputs and water vapor. So now going close nearer in time to 1945, you can see it's the same diagram, but the lines have got thicker, representing the increase in the flow through of materials and energy, including fossil materials. That's a source of energy, but you can think of them as materials initially when they come into the economy. And then in 1973, you see what's happening here. The global economy is increasing its requirements of materials and energy from the biosphere and increasing the emissions and production of waste on the far right-hand side. Here's 2002, here's 2015, and that's the latest I've been able to get hold of. But I'm pretty sure this increase has gone on since then. Another version of his diagram, which comes from his textbook with Josh Farley, is this notion that we've gone from an empty world where the economy, they're located inside the globe, was small in relation to it, where the width of these two lines linking the circle to welfare shows that when in his terms we had an empty world, most of human well-being came directly from the ecosystem and less in proportion from the economy. This has turned around now. You can see that most of the welfare is coming from the economy and much less from the ecosystem, which has been depleted by the expanding economy. Another point relating to that, which I just want to make, and then I'll move on. Mainstream economics is often the assumption that you can substitute what nature provides with what humans can build. Herman thought that was a mistake, by and large, that nature and human capital are really complements, not substitutes. So there you see the a graphic of an empty world with one fishing boat and loads of fish. And here you see loads of fishing boats and very few fish. And you don't catch many fish if the fish aren't there to be caught. And that's symptomatic of the full world. Another way of looking at Daly's influence is I've got here 8 boxes, each one representing a, if you like, school of thought or a collection of people with a common shared interest, looking for ways to think about and move us towards a post-growth world. So at the top, you have the steady state economy of Herman's, which I think has influenced all of the others. And I think the people involved in them will say so too. You have the circular economy, the regenerative economy, the well-being economy, buen vivir, which is a global south version, if you like, of the well-being economy. And I've put that there because we've got a lot to learn from the global south and how to run our economy better and be happier people. The donut economy you've probably heard of, which is about meeting the sustainable development goals within planetary boundaries. The degrowth movement, which again is very much related to the steady state economy, because it also emphasizes the physical size of an economy, and arguing that it should be reduced. Well, reduced not forever, presumably, but reduced to some sort of steady state, as Herman proposed. And then we have the eco-socialism, which goes beyond what can be done in capitalism, saying we have to change the whole economic system to have a proper post-growth world. In 2014, Herman received the Blue Planet Prize, and I'm going to read the citation. It says, Professor Herman Daly redefines steady-state economics through the concept of sustainability by incorporating such factors as the environment, local communities, quality of life, and ethics into economic theory, which led to building a foundation of ecological economics. He has been questioning whether economic growth brings happiness to humans and has been issuing warnings to society, which tends to overemphasize economic growth. As a consequence, he has had a significant intellectual influence. So here's a photograph of myself and Herman in 2018 when I spent a week interviewing him for the biography. It was a very memorable week for me, a high point in my life, I would have to say. And I don't know what he was thinking about me when this photo was taken, but I was thinking that he's a gentleman, well-liked and widely admired. He's an original thinker, an excellent writer, and he'll debate with anyone, and his ideas are more relevant today than ever. And with that, I thank you for your attention and look forward to hearing questions. Thank you very much.